What we really want to do this morning is focus on different institutional and personal responses. And so it's not an accident that we have on our panel this morning a group of people that represent a wide range of practice areas. And so we have a journalist, a religious leader, a leading academic and former World Bank official, a human rights activist, someone who works closely with the United Nations, and a legislator. So what we're hoping we can do is begin getting each of us thinking about who we are, where we sit, what our job is, and what we can do from our various perspectives, our various positions, our various platforms to understand and address problems of persecution. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. The long biographies are in the conference manual, and we include those as a reference, but also so that we can keep the introduction time to a minimum while we're together. David Briggs is Senior Advisor and Founding Executive Director of the International Association of Religion Journalists, and he's based here in the United States. Heikki Huttunen is the Very Reverend Presbyter of the Orthodox Church of Finland. Katherine Marshall, Senior Fellow, Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, Georgetown University, my alma mater, and Executive Director of World Faiths Development Dialogue in the United States. Professor Marshall also had a long career at the World Bank, and so brings very interesting perspectives from that experience as well. Evelina Ochab is a human rights advocate, an author, and someone who's heavily engaged with both the foreign ministry and the legislative branch on freedom of religion issues in the United Kingdom. Felipe Cuepo is the Information Officer, Civil Society Association focal point and liaison with faith-based organizations, civil society and advocacy section of the United Nations. So Felipe's job is to really interact with civil society and bring them into United Nations discourse. He was heavily involved in the United Nations conference that was held here in Salt Lake City just in August. Jim Shannon, Member of Parliament from the United Kingdom, is not able to be here because of the prorogation and the very active political events in the United Kingdom. And so we've asked Lord Alton from the House of Lords in the United Kingdom to join our panel. What I've asked our panelists to do is to keep their responses quite brief, in the 60 to 90 second range. My hope is by doing this, we can really have a conversation with each other, that we can ask a variety of questions, that we can have a rather informal exchange, and that we can invite the audience in to participate. What I'd like to do is to have the conversation moderated by me for the first half or so of our 90 minutes, and then open to the floor. When we open to the floor, I'll ask the same of you, which is to A, ask questions, and B, to be brief, so that we can hear as many voices and not get bogged down too much in making speeches and getting into defensive postures. One thing that is challenging about bringing a group from 60 countries together is that it's easy for us to fall into a position of feeling as if we're spokespeople for our misunderstood place. And all of our places are misunderstood. But our hope is that we can help people understand things from the perspective of from whence we come, but that also we can all be open to the need to be thoughtful and critical, even about our own places. As Lord Alton and Bishop Tendero's remarks yesterday evening made clear, we live at a time where there seems to be a surge in serious cases of religious persecution on a global level. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the importance of definitions. By persecution, we're really focusing on the systematic mistreatment of an individual or group of people in response to their religious beliefs or affiliations or lack thereof. By persecution, we mean something more than intolerance, discrimination, or even hostility. These things are bad enough, but here we want to focus on serious and systematic mistreatment of people and peoples based on their religious identity or their opposition to having a religious identity. These are often closely related to ethnic, linguistic, or cultural differences as well. Occasionally, persecution descends into something even more violent and bracing: atrocities, displacement, forced migrations, and even genocides. As Elizabeth Clark and I note in our introduction to the conference materials, persecution is, in a sense, paradoxical. How is it that, in a world with reduced poverty, better communications, and closer networks, almost 30 years after the end of the Cold War, and more than 70 years since the end of World War II, global religious persecution still persists? At the end of World War II, in a spirit of never again, the diverse drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights drew on a shared global commitment to human dignity as a basis for the protection of other rights, including the freedom to have or adopt a religion of one's choice. And yet, as mentioned last night, never again seems to have become again and again. We are all too familiar in our day, in our moment, with examples of religious persecution in the world. I'm not going to dwell on this because we got a really thorough and sobering account yesterday evening from Lord Alton. But consider the Daesh genocide unleashed in 2014, resulting in the annihilation of Yazidi and Christian communities in Iraq. Open Doors released a World Watch list in 2019 identifying 50 countries where it is difficult, if not impossible, to live as a Christian, including 11 countries with persecution that is extreme and 29 where it is very high. We have already heard estimates of between 200 and 250 million Christians who live in conditions of significant persecution. In a report issued earlier this summer, the Bishop of Truro, the Right Reverend Philip Montstephen, estimated that 1 in 3 people in the world suffer from religious persecution. Not just Christians, but people of every religious identity. One thing that is remarkable and easy to overlook because it has taken place over a 100-year period is the mass exodus of Christians from their ancestral homelands in the Middle East. Consider China. We're familiar with the long-standing persecution of Tibetan Buddhists, but today, in one of the most striking scale events of religious persecution, Muslims, Uyghurs in Xinjiang province are subject to re-education programs unlike anything we've seen since the darkest days of the Cultural Revolution. There are also other groups, such as Falun Gong and Church of Almighty God, that suffer very significant persecution, but also Christian house churches. I love the anecdote of the picture of Jesus being forced to be framed by a picture of Mao and Xi, and the religious leaders joking that Well, of course, the communist officials don't understand that it was thieves that were on either side of the Savior at his crucifixion. We're also increasingly concerned about the social credit system in China, the surveillance state, and the effect it has on people's ability to worship freely. Consider Iran and the way Baha'is, Jews, and Christians are targeted, or Pakistan, where Ahmadiyas are persecuted. India, where Muslims and Christians are increasingly targets of persecution and even violence. In Indonesia, we see a rising Islamism that has been disquieting for religious minorities, including Christians, Ahmadiyya, and even Shia Muslims. Myanmar, a place dear to my heart where I travel frequently, I'll be there again in December, where hundreds of Rohingya villages were destroyed, thousands killed, and as many as 1 million fleeing into refugee status into Bangladesh. But it's not just the Muslim minority that is under assault in Myanmar. The ethnic Christian communities, especially in places like Kachin State, are really afraid and suffering and sensing heightened elements of persecution. Consider North Korea, which we heard about yesterday evening, where more than 50,000 Christians are held in prisons and labor camps. We worry about Russia, where Jehovah's Witnesses and other non-Orthodox groups, especially those with foreign affiliations, are targeted for persecution, often under the guise of national security. I think we also need to be mindful about what's happening in the United States. Islamophobia remains a significant problem. We've seen violent attacks at places of worship from people from a variety of traditions. And even Christians complain openly that they face discrimination, hostility, and persecution. Well, like I said, I don't want to begin with a long litany, but I want to open with an initial question to our panel. Is there anything else in particular that we should mention that has perhaps so far yesterday evening and today gone unmentioned? Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. The latest report of the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief of the United Nations, Mr. Shahid, in 2019 is on anti-Semitism, and is one of the main groups that is currently being targeted, and violence against the Jewish community has experienced a rise globally. So it's not just the United States or elsewhere, but within the Northern Hemisphere, but in general, globally, the Jewish community is once again victim of targeted attacks and just discrimination and persecution and prosecution, also legal prosecution.
Evelina?
I think already yesterday Nigeria was mentioned, but I think it's really important to emphasize maybe that there are two different aspects of the atrocities in Nigeria. One is, of course, perpetrated by Boko Haram, and one by the Fulani herdsmen. And the atrocities perpetrated by Boko Haram are categorized as crimes against humanity and are already being considered by the International Criminal Court, but the atrocities perpetrated by the Fulani herdsmen are not being considered by the International Criminal Court, and they may arguably amount to genocide, and that they are being considered by the government in Nigeria as possible genocide. And maybe one situation that was not mentioned neither yesterday or today is the situation of Baha'is in Yemen. And also there are some elements that may suggest that the atrocities perpetrated against the Baha'is in Yemen may amount or may turn into genocide at some point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think it is worth highlighting that even genocide, which is sort of the systematic effort to eradicate a people, we see examples that really rise to that level. In the last few years, we've seen this with Daesh in Iraq. We've seen it in Myanmar with the treatment of the Rohingya, and we see it again in Nigeria, even as we meet and speak. And so it is sobering. Let me shift to a question of your sense, and I'd like each of our panelists, David, let me begin with you, but your sense of why is it that persecution is such a persistent problem? Why did never again not mean lesson learned, let's be different?
Well, perhaps I might begin with a topic that I think is very significant to all of this, and it's it's something that's problematic in politics and the media and our cultures, and perhaps even in academia, humility. We've gotten into an extraordinarily polarized culture, a culture where we can't talk to one another, understand one another, and we set the stage up for persecution with a very going back to even our earliest hunter-gatherer ancestors, where once we feel that we ourselves are threatened, we huddle back and we attack the other. And I think this is a very great problem. And I think the answer lies in trying to once again understand one another, to be open to different points of view, to treat one another with respect and dignity. Because once you exclude any one group, and it's the case whether it's in Indonesia, Egypt, the United States, Switzerland, anywhere around the world, once you put any one group to the side, a minority group or a secular group, then you allow for if you don't allow that group to feel part of society, you start the cycle of violence and conflict, that group will immediately feel outside of the society and will react, and then their reactions will be a reaction in turn, and it leads down that cycle of violence and conflict. So I would say that, and we've seen the dangers pop up in the countries you've mentioned, Dr. Scharff, and I would issue a call to just common recognition of the dignity of others, and an expression of our own humility toward others, valuing each person, as some might say, as being created in the image of God.
Father Huttunen?
That's a very wise point of view, and would be a good orientation to follow. I would, however, add a difficulty to that. If we have an exchange of views and experiences, what if they are not on the same level? What I'm getting at is what we have experienced in Europe, a post-secular use of religious identities. The political use of religious identities, which has led to persecution and even genocide-like situations in the ex-Yugoslav wars, or presently, I think now, some of the phenomena in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, where religious identity is used for extreme violation and almost an annihilation of another group of people. The problem for me is that in a post-secular situation, religious identity doesn't function. It is an identity which is used without spirituality, without its real religious content. As an imam from Norway said, that the response to Islamist extremism is not less Islam, but more Islam. And I understand his meaning as an Orthodox Christian, looking at my brothers and sisters in faith, being used, or their identity being used, misused, in a political context, and therefore, if we want to look for answers to why never again became again and again, probably we also need to look at the whole context of human rights and the whole context of human development of the human community in the world.
Professor Marshall?
In the various worlds where I'm working, I think we are all struggling to understand what's happening. And we're trying to understand at the global level what's led to the polarization, to the increase in violence, and in case after case. I'm very struck on some countries which were highlighted, which have been highlighted even this morning, Nigeria, Central African Republic, Myanmar, that you can hear, even on a same panel, someone saying this is a religious conflict, and someone else will say this has nothing to do with religion. So I think that one of our responsibilities at both the global level and at the local level is to try to understand better what does religion have to do with it and what does it not have to do with. But just to bring in a few, I think the topic that's most discussed in a Gallup poll across the world is corruption. And when you look at the recruitment to extremist groups, very often corruption is the leading issue. So the issue of corruption, which has the advantage that it's something we could do something about, seems to be a big issue. Just to list 5, there are also lots of studies that show that the prosperity of nations is intimately linked to gender equality. And the doubts about gender equality are an issue. The rising inequality or the increasing complexity of inequality, issues of demography, and finally issues of climate change. All of them have people who would present them as the explanation of why we're seeing increasing violence and polarization. And if there is an insight that we have that's reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, it is that these issues are interconnected. And I think the failure, I've spent many decades sitting in country strategy meetings, sort of trying to figure out what's happening in Nigeria, for example, or another country. The religious freedom issue has never been on the agenda in the settings where I've been. But I think it fits well with some of the other aspects of analysis. So trying to find a way to have more context at both the global level, but also at the local level. Just to finish, I think we all remember Tolstoy's comment that all happy families are pretty much alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So how do we navigate the complexities of each situation with some of these broad global trends?
Thank you, Professor Marshall. Boy, you've raised a number of things I hope we can touch back upon again. The gender equality issue is really an important piece of this, and as we see who is suffering, it's so often women and girls in these situations, but not just, but in ways that are really harrowing and should shock our conscience. I think also the point about the interconnectedness of the various components is important. Ms. Ochab, could I give the floor to you?
Sure. I do believe that the issue of religious persecution has been neglected for way too long. We've been missing the red flags of, for example, mass atrocities to come. And one of course, the best example is of genocide. I think it is really important to emphasize that genocide does not just happen. It requires organization, it requires planning, it requires preparation, and above it all, it requires our ignorance of the red flags. So of course, if we miss the red flags, we'll be addressing the atrocities way too late, and we will always fail to prevent the atrocities from occurring in the first place.
Thanks, Evelina. this focus on genocide and the atrocities that happen, and the planning and the proximity of what happens, I think is really bracing. I was at a conference in Baghdad last December, and Baroness Nicholson told a story that has just resonated in my mind since, and it was of one of these young girls who had been sold into sexual slavery, a Yazidi girl, and she had been handed from husband to husband, and at one point she recognized one of them and was trying to figure out who it was, and it was their family's dentist. And it was not a stranger from afar, it was a neighbor who she thought there had been a peaceful, cooperative relationship with. And that really brought home to me that persecution is often easy to think of as a problem out there, far away, and yet it may manifest itself in our own lives and in our own communities in ways that maybe persecution is too strong a word, but maybe not. Lord Alton, let me turn the floor to you.
What has been changing in the world. We can cast our own minds back within the Christian faith tradition and remember that St. Stephen, the church's business manager, was the first to be stoned to death for his faith. And in those early centuries, Nero and Diocletian and others persecuted Christians. The 20th century saw more Christian martyrs than all the preceding centuries put together. And one thinks of the persecution of the Orthodox Church in Russia, the Ukrainian Catholic Church. I visited Ukraine during that period. I visited Russia during that period. And extraordinary stories, harrowing stories of people who'd spent decades in prisons, many just dying there. So it's always been here as part of our lives in all our religious faiths that there has been persecution. But the intensity of it now and the scale of it, I think, is really, truly awesome. And one of the things I pointed to last night, but I think is a factor, not a cause, but a factor in the scale of this, is communication and the internet, but also the growth of radical ideologies and our failure to challenge those ideologies, and even within the faith traditions. So something like Sharia law, for instance, can be used as a justification for discrimination against women if a woman is only worth half the value of a man in the context of giving evidence in a court. That doesn't say much for the value of every human being, or when a Yazidi girl can be abducted in the way you've just heard described because she is not from a monotheistic religion, as though that is some kind of justification for what you then do to her. This is intolerable, and we have got to learn to say so. But I would say there's one other factor, and that's the failure of the international order. In 1948, out of the ashes of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and the rest, and I agree with what Felipe was saying about how it always begins with the Jews, but it never ends there. And we need to be very conscious of what is happening to the Jewish community around the world at this time. It is the canary in the mine for me, the harbinger of what can come. But in 1948, out of the horrors of the Holocaust, came this extraordinary outpouring of international effort. And I was saying to former High Court Judge, Supreme Court Judge, Mr. Jalani last night, that the role of people like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, for instance, in 1948 in promoting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which he supported and Pakistan supported, is not something you will necessarily find today in some of the same countries that were willing to support that declaration at the time. But even worse than that, those liberal countries that supported the declaration and supported the promotion of the Genocide Convention in the same year, have been found very wanting in the way that those things have been upheld. So, for instance, Mr. Justice Kirby was asked to investigate North Korea by the United Nations. He brings in a report that says at the end of it, there is evidence that there have been crimes against humanity. He said this should be referred to the International Criminal Court. But the Security Council has failed to do that, or even to consider the report, because they're fearful that China or Russia would veto such a reference. So there's a failure of the international community. Someone like Omar al-Bashir, the leader of Sudan, though no longer now under arrest in Sudan, but he's still not been brought before the International Criminal Court, even though he was charged with genocide for what happened in Darfur, where 200,000 to 300,000 people were killed and 2 million people displaced, most of them Muslims, but people who were not prepared to conform to the kind of radical Islam that he was seeking to impose. And we have been, I think, queasy in our unwillingness to speak out and name these things for what they are. And truth must speak to power. I think that we have failed. The international order has been allowed to collapse in many cases, and we have failed to uphold institutions like the International Criminal Court and make sure it does the job it was founded to do. And by failing to bring people to justice, it then creates a climate of impunity where others think that they can get away freely and easily with the sorts of things that Ewelina has just described happening in Nigeria, for instance, today.
You know, I think as we think about what's different, what's driving things today, the issue you raised about technology, I think, is really important. I mean, I see a couple dimensions to it. One is what you mentioned, which is the use of the technology to spread radical ideology, and that really seems to be a problem, whether we're talking about white supremacy or whether we're talking about extreme forms of other ideologies. Another is simply the volume. There's so much that we're aware of and so much happening. I think of just the law and religion headlines that we try to put out a couple times a week. It's overwhelming to simply look at the list, and it's easy to feel quite powerless in the face of the scale and the number of things we see. Felipe, let me ask you to give your perspective on what is different, what's happening now, what helps, how can we understand why this is happening?
So let me go back a little bit to 1945 with the UN creation and the reasons for the creation of the United Nations, which is the world had specific geopolitical challenges. Move forward to 2019, and the new challenges are more ideological than geopolitical in a sense. And the new work of the UN should be divided into three groups: education, communication, and diplomacy. And I think while we are the best connected generation in history, we are probably one of the least educated in the issues that we are talking about. And the problem is also the lack of public support because of I agree with Dr. Marshall on the polarization of the situation, has been politicized. The religious persecution, religious discrimination has become a political matter, just like climate change has become a political matter and other issues. And with that, you polarize situations, you have media, which obviously freedom of expression is extremely important, but nowadays, media has become more a source of opinion than information. And that is also a little bit complicated to have that much access to information, but then is not controlled, is not monitored. There's no editors that edit any social media reports. So that overload and volume of information that we receive, and sometimes polarized or biased, politicized. The sense that I have is that when I talk with different groups and NGOs mostly, is people are desensitized. They hear so much and so many atrocities and so many bad things are happening, they just don't feel the need and the urge because it's not close to home. Unless something happens, like a mass shooting or something happens at home. When it happens abroad, it's too bad. I turn the channel to another channel, I just change and I forget about it. It doesn't impact me. And the desensitization of individuals and societies have come accustomed to hear so many bad things that it doesn't really matter. It's not part of the driving force for them to vote or to participate politically or even socially. So I think that civil society has the mandate, the group that I work with has the mandate to really monitor, as has been mentioned before, but also push a specific agenda, which is, okay, we need to bring back to the table the issues because we have a resurgence of this kind of actions and feelings and sentiments because we have not been able to educate properly individuals. And education, I mean formal education institutions like this, but also informal education amongst friends, families, culture, and then communication. What kind of media do I consume? What kind of entertainment do I get? All of those factors led to the, again, lack of sympathy or, we have this apathy in society towards these issues, and I think is one of the dangers that we're facing.
Yeah, Thank you for that. It gives us a lot to think about. Focusing on this question of we live in a time of great ideological turmoil that is really remarkable. I mean, I think even in the United States, of our basic consensus around fundamental foundational principles is really contested in a way that is remarkable and maybe a little different than what we've seen. Professor Marshall, this kind of picks up on one of the things you mentioned that I'd like to ask you to expand upon a little bit, and that's sort of this issue of the narratives and the stories, and the is this a religious problem or is this not a religious problem? Could you expand and develop that theme a little bit further for us?
Well, I have to say I spend a certain amount of time trying to figure it out. But basically, the way that the arguments come out, just to take Nigeria, which has already been mentioned here,
good example.
Is that, first of all, I think Pew surveys and people's anecdotal evidence shows that these are very religious communities, very religious societies with a long history going way back to even before the colonial era, of quite different differences among the Muslim and the non-Muslim communities, of course, traditional. But you will hear the surveys seem to show that people think there's a religious dimension to the conflicts, that it's got something to do with religion. But the president and ministers, people who are making policy, will say this has nothing to do with religion. It is about, it's much more, if anything, about ethnic differences. But it is above all about economics and levels of education. And it is, let's put this on the table, about politicians who are deliberately manipulating the population. So I think one needs to spend quite a bit of time looking at that. Now, in Myanmar, you get the same argument, that this has nothing to do with Buddhist Muslim, the Rohingya situation. There is one feature that I think is something that has struck me, at least, in looking at Southeast and South Asia, is how many of the situations are about national identity and the way that religion is linked to national identity. And with almost all of the most persecuted minorities, we're seeing this in Assam, we're seeing it even in Thailand and other places, these are people who don't belong in our country. So it comes down to issues of citizenship. So the questions about, appreciating all the research shows that diversity is a good thing, et cetera. This is simply not part of the narrative. So how you overcome these very, very different narratives to understand what is actually happening, why it's happening, and then, above all, what you do about it. How you can think about changing your education system, changing your political system, and dealing with corruption, dealing with economics, dealing with the other kinds of inequalities.
Yeah, the link to nationalism is really interesting, isn't it? Because there's often sort of a major religious group, and we really have a sense, I have a sense, that in many places around the world, the political leaders are sort of exploiting and utilizing majoritarian religious identity in ways to pursue nationalist narratives that often have either intended or side effects of persecution. I think, for example, of India and Modi. I think of Russia and Putin. I think of Myanmar. I think of Turkey. I think of Hungary. I think even of the United States. We don't think of this as we don't think of Trump primarily as a Christian nationalist leader, but there are certainly strands that are of nationalism. He proudly calls himself a nationalist. There are strands of nationalism that have implications for others that are really remarkable. Father Huhtinen?
Thank you. Yeah, I think this discussion brings to my mind the example of Turkey and the what happened to the Armenian people, whether we are ready to call it a genocide or not. It was, my reading of that history is that it was not motivated by an Islamic motive, but what the result was that Christians were the victims. And not only Armenian Christians, also Assyrian and Greek. And you could salvage yourself, it seems, from that situation in converting to Islam. I don't think it makes Islam the culprit, but it shows us how a majority religion has been used in giving birth to a nation, which was, I think, the political purpose of the Young Turks at the time, to form a new nation, and in that they fall very much into the non-religious, secularist European ideologies, fascist and communist, of the 20th century.
David, what about the media? What's the role? I think, I'm not sure, I think it was Felipe talking about the shift from news to opinion, the fact that we have so much news that's unfiltered and unedited. I even sense a significant difference in major media outlets. I feel like the New York Times is much more of an advocacy organization than maybe than I perceived it to be a generation ago. What's your sense of the media and its role in all of this?
Well, it's extraordinarily important, and just like the politicians and many other parts of society, and Felipe mentioned it's critical parts of our culture, such as the entertainment culture and its depiction of individuals. The media has become part of this, increasingly part of this segmented culture. So well, one thing that always amuses me is when I read the media saying, come to us for the truth. We are the truth. And it used to be they kind of attacked religion for saying it has the truth, or making a claim that God is truth. But well, now the media is the truth. And you are right that in many, well, it's segmented, and you are right in some of the major papers, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, and on the other side, Fox News and many other have fallen on one side of this divide. And we're still searching. Our responsibility as media is to accurately portray the information. And we're not getting the information from the politicians, and we're not getting the information in a large part from the academic community. And we're in a position ourselves where we're under severe financial problems. So it's easy to appeal to your core audience, and that extends throughout the world. You don't want to upset your core audience by saying, well, they might be prejudiced, or they might, and a lot of times it leads to not dealing with religion at all in many countries in the world. But I think the overarching point that I think has been, and you'll hear more from Roger Finke tomorrow on his terrific research into the reasons for persecution. But basically, I think we're all responsible for persecution. Even the remarks we make to a neighbor at the store, denigrating a particular, it might be a secular person, it might be an atheist, it might be a Muslim, it might be a conservative Christian. This all leads to that, it doesn't lead to a humble dialogue learning about our neighbors. I'll tell you, in 30 years of reporting in the United States and throughout the world, I found people are basically the same. What they want is the same. But there are many people that would manipulate that for their own ends, including religious groups. And specifically, I remember being in Egypt during the Arab Spring, and a colleague saying to me, what we really fear are two things. One, that another candidate might be elected and the Muslim Brotherhood might respond, or that the Muslim Brotherhood might be elected and the military would respond. And what we saw there is that the media had a narrative believing Muslims are dangerous or bad, and the secular, even though the secular community did not live up to its ideals during the Arab Spring when they all were together. When they first found out they were going to lose, they pulled out of the election, and they tried to, from the beginning, disrupt the election. When the Muslim Brotherhood was elected, they became an ally of the very thing they feared the most, just because their hatred of one triumphed over the other. And we saw what happened. And we saw that a lot of the countries that should be declaring against religious freedom stood in the sidelines because they were basically an ally of the West and a lot of other countries. But what happened there was a travesty of human rights and religious freedom. And I particularly remember being in the Coptic Orthodox church at the time, and I'm just someone to listen, but I was trying to tell them, do not get involved in this. It's only going to turn out badly for you, and it's not your role to be. And what it did is they aligned themselves with the political party, the military, and there were tragedies after that. So I would, if we could take one thing away from this conference, I would say that each one of us are responsible in a world where the truth is not often communicated, and particularly in the media, to humbly search for the truth and to courageously present that would do a great service toward reducing religious persecution.
Thank you. That's really a powerful point. Evelina, let me turn the floor to you, but as I do that, Father Huuttinen, let me ask you to prepare for the next question, which is, last night Bishop Tindaro identified Islamic oppression, political authoritarianism, and religious nationalism as three of the big underlying problems. You mentioned secularism as well, and I'd like you to expand that thought a little bit, especially as it relates to your work in Europe. What is the role of secularism in contributing to the challenges that we're facing? But first, Evelina, let me give you the floor.
I wanted to comment on the issue of media involvement briefly, mostly because I write opinion pieces, so it's just fair that I comment on the opinion part. And of course, there is a difference between writing news pieces and opinion pieces. And the way I approach my op-eds that I write for Forbes is that I normally present the information, what's happening in a country. Then I include my opinion, of course, and propose some kind of solutions. So possibly it's not the usual way of addressing or approaching op-eds. However, I think, of course, media outlets play a very important role in responding, reporting on religious persecution. And just a few months ago, the UK and Canada launched a new initiative called Defend Media Freedom that's supposed to address the issue of violence against journalists all over the world. But during the conference, they also addressed the issue of religious reporting. And one of the messages that came out from that conference was that there are less and less journalists reporting on religious persecution. And even among those journalists who are out there, there is the growing issue of religious illiteracy that needs to be addressed. So, of course, this is a massive issue that if religious conflict is reported on incorrectly, then of course that can cause a lot of problems. But I think it's also important to emphasize that media outlets are not being used only to report on religious persecution, to inform us, but sometimes media outlets are also being used to spread propaganda. And this is very dangerous. And of course, we need to work towards action, how to address such misinformation, propaganda that is being spread and is being used to justify sometimes violence against religious minorities. And this is the case, for example, in Yemen, where media outlets are spreading propaganda about Baha'i minorities. So I think this is definitely something that needs to be addressed and requires more attention.
Reverend Hutunen.
Yeah, thank you. Europe is responsible for 2 world wars in the 20th century. And especially the Second World War happened in a context of secularization. There were 2 aggressively and violently secular ideologies, communism and fascism, or Nazism, if we use those rubrics for them, that were seen as solutions and sort of beginnings of a new existence in Europe. There was this kind of a magical belief in a new life after destruction. So in order to give birth to a new society, a new human being, we have to destroy the old one. And this happened under very clear non-religious and anti-religious ideologies. It is interesting that a generation or 2 generations after these tragedies, Europeans have not found a balanced approach with religion. And Europe has continued to be secularized, and there are different brands of secularization in Europe. There is the post-Protestant one, there's the post-Catholic one, there's the post-Orthodox one, and then there's the post-communist one. And all of them are different brands of a similar phenomenon. For minorities, secularization can be a liberation, that the society is not solely defined by values of a majority religion, is of course, in many cases, a positive development for the minorities. But what we are now seeing in Europe in the last 20 years, very clearly, is a development of a rather aggressive secularist ideology which wants to present all religions and all religious activity as something threatening to humanity, something negative. And there are very similar ideas floating around which we saw happen in the Soviet Union. For example, the willingness to deny or even prohibit religious education of children, or to take that completely into the private sphere. The place of religion in the public sphere is a question which is discussed very much in different European situations. And in dealing with the encounter with Islam, some European states are looking for solutions of control and legislations to control religion in general, and of course they have Islam in their mind in particular, but in some cases it has been seen that minorities, small minorities, smaller than Islam, are suffering from those legal consequences. So we have a really varied picture of a developing secularization, including secularism as an idea. I think that a sound response is also visible, and that is where the religious communities are able to move from a traditional majority-minority position into something more dialogical among themselves. And in that way, they will be able to play a more comprehensive and more connected role in the society, and then also to counter the misuse of religion, which I was referring to earlier. I'm saying that a hollow religious identity, which has been emptied of its spirituality, is and then can be used with a divine mandate for political or identity purposes, is the most dangerous result of secular developments. But there are others that can create a new context for a more positive role of religion in the society.
Thank you. So I'd like to open to the floor. At the very end, I'd like to ask each of our panelists to address a question of, from their institutional perspective as journalists, religious leaders, academics, writers and advocates, as legislators, as UN officials, what from that institutional position can be done to address persecution? So that's the question we'll end with. But we have some microphones, and I see a hand here. Let's begin there. If you could say your name and ask a question, and I need everyone to speak into the microphone because our interpreters are in a different room, and they can't hear what we're saying here without the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Can Oğuz. I'm the Consul General of Turkey in Los Angeles. My question is, why at the plenary level, where we discuss various perspectives, regional and sectoral or thematic perspectives, we cannot hear the views of the Muslim world on this issue? You briefly referred to rising Islamophobia, white supremacism, but we're not talking about, for example, the attitude about some Western countries against Muslim immigrants, and, for example, the Gaza and West Bank issue, Palestine. And I think it also, I don't want to make it about this, but this kind of lack of perspective and oversight to the other side's views apply to what I think Heikki Utunen said, and to a certain extent yesterday. He reiterated the dominant Christian view about what happened to the Armenians. And the issue is that, at that time, it's easy to throw numbers, but I don't think that it's good when humans are involved. Almost 600,000, 700,000 Muslims in the Ottoman Empire were killed, some by Armenians, some due to other atrocities. So I think it would have been good at the plenary level, I'm not the right person to do that, to have heard from the Muslim world how they feel about all these issues and the background and the root causes about certain dynamics affecting that region.
Thank you. That's a really constructive suggestion. We try and sometimes fall short. What I would ask is, let's evaluate overall after we've been able to hear from all of the groups and all of the panels, and there will probably still be need for readjustments and a good balance. The reality is we do find it more difficult to engage with the Muslim world than many other parts of the world. And we're still learning and still working on getting better at that. I'll be traveling to Jordan next month to strive to lay the groundwork for an additional conference there on the A Common Word, King Abdullah's effort on that. We organized a conference in Jordan 2 years ago on the Amman message. We do think it's really important, I'm speaking on behalf of our center now, to engage in responsible and meaningful ways with the Muslim world. A lot of the work I do is in Indonesia, and we're working on a course book on Sharia and human rights, which I think is a bridge-building effort that Tora Lindholm has been involved with as well.
Our center is committed to an annual conference each year focusing on the Muslim world. This year it was in the United Arab Emirates. The year before it was in Jordan. The year before it was in Morocco. But we need to do more and better. And we've also partnered on conferences in Turkey, 2 major ones in the last 5 years. But the criticism and the advice, I think, is well taken. So thank you for that.
Thank you. My name is Donald Ramotar from Guyana. I agree a lot with what Professor Marshall had mentioned, that a lot of these issues sometimes are covered by religion, but sometimes their roots are far different. And I wanted to make a similar point that my colleague behind me made just now, that if we're talking about human dignity, one of the places that I believe is one of the worst places in the world where human beings are degraded, it's in Palestine. And if you're talking about, not a word has been said about it here, and I think that that is probably a solution to that problem will go a very, very far way in solving a lot of the issues within the Middle East itself. And what must also be factored in, which is a bigger question again, but a lot of these people have lost hope, and that has given rise to a lot of extremism within the systems themselves. And to describe some of the acts of the Palestinians as terrorists sometimes needs to be re-examined to people who has no possibility to see any hope of their development in life. This is a country of people who have been chased out of their land, who don't have a home. I mean, how would any one of us feel to have somebody walking into our house and throw us out, to have put somebody else inside? Obviously, sometimes these things takes on a religious context, but very often it is the roots of it is not in religion.
Thank you.
And I think we need to look at some of that itself.
So, Katherine, let me invite you to respond. I think this is something you touched on, which I love the phrase you used, the complexities of inequality. As I have thought about what's happening in the world, I sometimes think about sort of the consequences of globalization, and I think about 2 groups, the left behinds and the sick and tireds. The left behinds, those who haven't benefited from the globalization and have sometimes been materially hurt by it. And the sick and tireds, those who are tired of being called a racist or a sexist or a bigot or having their views distorted and characterized in a way that seems unfair. What do you think about this question about underlying roots versus sort of what we see above ground? Maybe it's underlying roots that are different than religion, and then what we see on top is that it looks like a religious conflict when it might not be. But also this question of inequality and how this is shaping what we're experiencing.
Big questions.
Yeah.
But to start, I think part of the reason people will argue so vehemently that this is not about religion is that it is so rarely about religious beliefs. I was listening to a presentation about one of the sort of side dimensions, but I think it's a significant dimension, which is the trying to understand the motivations for recruitment to extremist groups. And that could be both religious extremist groups, but also to populist groups. And the answers to the questions, even when the identities were clear, Muslim, Christian, whatever, it was very rarely about the beliefs. It was not about, it could be about symbols of what you eat or the cows in India, but it is so rarely about the Trinity or the complexities of religious beliefs, but it comes to these very complex issues around identities. Now, the inequality issue is, clearly this comes back to the media again, that inequality from the French Revolution or from whatever has been a cause of unhappiness and the sense of unfairness, etc. But now it is in your face, the way that the wealthy live within societies and the levels of anger at the unfairness and the injustice, and particularly when you have the loss of faith in institutions, certainly loss of faith in governments, but also loss of faith in the private sector, in civil society, in so many other institutions, which I think is one of our sort of global trends that we need to worry about. But this is why I think this corruption issue is one that we should be looking at. And I work quite a bit with the international anti-corruption networks, Transparency International and the International Anti-Corruption Conference. And one thing that's striking is that there are very few religious actors involved in the global anti-corruption movements, which is a real puzzle, because one would think this is a leading ethical, moral, and practical issue, and it is something you can do something about. So the question of at least trying to get some hope back into the fairness of government. Just as a last comment on that, my colleagues in the World Bank, basically one reason why they haven't focused so much on religious persecution or these issues is that there is a basic confidence that if you get societies moving, that you have education, jobs, health care, and some kind modicum of justice and fairness within a society, that a lot of these other problems will go away. Now, to some extent, the current waves of populism and polarization put those assumptions into question. But I don't think it changes the fact that it is the failed societies that are the big problems. It is the failure, the fragility, which relates to government, which relates to policy, which relates to underlying cultural and economic factors that are contributing to the breakdown in so many traditional ways that people got along.
Thank you. Really important observations. I think the loss of faith in institutions, the focus on corruption are really important.
Good morning. My name is Thiago. I'm from Brazil and I the Brazilian Institute of Law and Religion. The objective of any freedom, including religion's freedom, is to serve human dignity. Okay? So Islam should have religion's freedom in the Covenant of Nations from the Quran view of infidels. Islam should enjoy religion's freedom when it hurts human dignity. Ask to Lord Elton, please.
Who is your question directed at, Professor Vieira?
Lord Elton. Lord Elton.
Lord Alton. Thank you. Lord Alton.
Well, I think the question gets to the issue of how religions view themselves and how religious leaders moderate those religions. One of the earlier questioners gave the example, for instance, of the Palestinians. And it is true that people can easily be recruited. I've visited the refugee camps, I've visited the West Bank and Gaza, and if you leave people in festering conditions, obviously the devil will make mischief with idle hands, so the recruiting agent is able to use them. But if your religious leaders are not also at the same time questioning the nature of their scriptures and their teachings in our present circumstances, then that can also then be exploited by groups like Hamas, or it can be exploited by ISIS or Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or any of the operatives we see. I shared a platform with the young woman Malala, who was nearly murdered, of course, by the Taliban in Pakistan. Why? Because she wanted an education. And famously says, one book, one teacher, one pen can change the world. And she is right. But people wanted her, in the name of their religion, not to have an education, because they said that a woman didn't need to be educated. Or the minorities that another questioner referred to that I mentioned last night from Pakistan, and the squalor that they are living in, where they're told the only jobs you can have are latrine cleaners and road sweepers and so on. This comes from a view of religion that has to be challenged. Now, there are people challenging these things, and in Pakistan, for instance, I met during my visit there last November some of the Supreme Court judges. They are some of the bravest men I've ever met. And one of them said, I will make sure that this case, which had been festering for 9 years, an illiterate woman in a prison cell because she drank some water out of the same well as people from the majority faith, that he would bring her case forward. He did it within the month. There were mobs baying for his death as a consequence of doing that. I mentioned Shahbaz Bhatti last night, but his closest friend was Salman Taseer, who was the Muslim governor of the Punjab. He was also assassinated because he stood alongside Shahbaz Bhatti in demanding that the laws should be changed. So I think that the way we challenge law, the way that religious leaders themselves reinterpret their own doctrines and faith in these times is crucially important. And although I agree with everything that Katherine and others have been saying about the interconnectedness of issues, and I mentioned last night things like the 70 million people who are displaced at the moment in the world. There are many factors that lead to that, but we know that since 2014 that 1 in 5 of those people displaced have come from places where there is religious conflict. So you think of the Rohingya Muslims, you think now of people trying to get out of China who are Uyghurs. So I'm not indifferent to the plight of other religions. What I've been saying is that I think that we must see through the lens of Article 18, which is a secular document, the right of all people to have a religious faith, not just to worship, by the way, which is often the interpretation put on this by some of our civil servants who often betray a sort of religious illiteracy. I don't want the right to worship, I want religious freedom. These are two very different things. And it's not for the state to tell me I can worship or not worship, but it is for the state to uphold my right to have a belief or not to have a belief, or to change that belief. But if within your religion you have something that says someone can be executed for changing their religion, like the converts from Iran, then that is a religious issue. That isn't about the prosperity of Iran or elsewhere. Or when a shopkeeper gets in his car in England and drives up to Scotland because someone there is an Ahmadi who has wished his Christian customers a happy Easter, and for calling himself a Muslim when he's an Ahmadi, and the other man said, you don't have the right to do that because you are not a true Muslim, and murders him as a consequence, then this is a religious issue that has to be addressed. When 5 million Ahmadis in Pakistan are denied civil liberties and civil rights because they insist on calling themselves Muslims, well, why shouldn't they have the right to define themselves as they wish rather than the way others would have them seen? These are religious questions. So there is an interconnectedness, certainly, but I don't think we should dodge the fundamental question you rightly have raised, Professor, which is how do we moderate religion? And this is true for Christians, it's true for Hindus, it's true for all the great faiths.
I think it's often going to be the case that it's going to be the best of religion that defeats the worst of religion, rather than something from the outside. So I'm committed to our staying on schedule and ending on time, especially, so that we can have our break. And so we have 15 minutes left. I want to ask each of our panelists to address the question that I posed a moment ago, which is, from your institutional perspective as journalist, religious leader, professor, activist, legislator, UN official, if you could give your institution a nudge or a piece of advice, what could be done institutionally to address the problems of persecution that we've seen? David, let me begin with you.
Well, this is a challenge for journalism today. As I mentioned, not only are many of the media outlets segmented, but there are countless other media outlets that promote themselves through their own perspective. So it's a very difficult challenge. In the about 10 years ago, a number of journalists from many nations formed the International Association of Religion Journalists to try to address this issue. You know, we knew we could do better reporting on religion in our own countries, but we knew there's a great problem in understanding religious issues in other countries. So the words we kept coming back to, and it falls with the human dignity aspect of this conference, is mutual respect and dignity. We learn from one another. We learn the people in Pakistan from their perspective. They have seen tens of thousands of their own people die in the religious violence in that country. And many rightly understand that as being in part imposed by Western governments, including the US, who came in, they funded the most extreme madrasas, they funded the so-called freedom fighters, and now Pakistan is left with the problems caused by those issues. And to understand Pakistan, you have to understand the many different religious parties, the fact that the average people there believe in democracy, and they're trying, under very trying circumstances, to hold on to democracy, to bring our own narrative about what Pakistan should be doing and not understand the pressures on the people of Pakistan is wrong. And the same thing with Indonesia, you know, a country it's you know, one of the major democracies in the Islamic world. But they have their own pressures, just like we do in America and other countries. And it was a sad day when the mayor of Jakarta, when the president of Indonesia had to depose the mayor of Jakarta, who was, many would say, falsely accused of blasphemy. But these are decisions that countries have to make. But if you want to understand religion in Indonesia, you have to understand the many different political parties and the many different perspectives. There are four, for example, of what might be called political parties motivated by Islam. Very, very different approaches. And to bring your own narrative about what a party motivated by Islam is to all of those parties is not going to be helpful to the situation. So I guess what I would encourage that people have mentioned religious literacy first, and then humility, an openness to new ideas, to do what journalists have always strove to do for the ideal of our profession.
Thank you.
Okay.
I really love this emphasis on the humility to seek the truth and the financial pressures that the media are under and the felt need to not offend core constituency, I think is really an important point that I haven't thought adequately about. So thank you for bringing that to our thinking. Reverend Huhtinen.
Thank you. I think to address religious persecution and to work for human dignity, the religious communities themselves, we have to look at our own guilt in this history. We have to look at our own responsibility in terms of having been involved in situations of religious persecution or having broken human dignity in different ways. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the religious communities have huge networks. We have a network of in the whole world, from the local level to the global level, and we must use this connection to addressing inequality, to address hopelessness, and to address this question why the religions are not involved in anti-corruption, which is something which I will take home from this discussion, among other things. And thirdly, as has been mentioned by several speakers here, religious literacy. That allows criticism from within. If we know our own religious tradition and our own religious thinking, our own religious language, we're able to challenge misuse and misconceptions from within. And this is where I hope, that's my fourth point, that the religious leaders who have visibility, locally, nationally, globally, would take some, maybe not even the lead, but some visibility to deal with this, and then to do these things together. When religious leaders come together, present themselves together to the public, that has also symbolic importance. And luckily, we have some, both on national and on the global level, who are doing this, but we need more.
Thank you. I think all four of those points are really valuable. I think as I think about the role of religious communities, they're often the greatest source of the problem, and they're often going to be the source of the solution. It's we're going to need that engagement and understanding our own histories, our own culpabilities, building networks, working on literacy, and especially this idea of working together, I think, is really important. Professor Marshall.
Some years ago, I was in a car with the Archbishop of Cape Town at the time, Ndungane, and it was at a time, which is of course happening now, when there was a lot of preoccupation about Zimbabwe. And I knew that he was somehow involved, but there was also criticism of him that he'd not spoken out enough about it. And so I was just asking what's going on in Zimbabwe, and he said with great frustration, you can't be an advocate and a mediator at the same time. So if I think— You can't
be an advocate
and a mediator.
A mediator, right, thanks.
In other words, you can't be trying to solve the problem and also be an advocate. And I think that, speaking from an academic, but I also do some writing, sort of media perspective, I think that the effort to try to understand has to be a major part. And this is an issue on which there are such dramatically different narratives and such levels of anger, even between the United States and Europe, but within the American community and the human rights. One of the tragedies is that the human rights community and the religious freedom communities are not communicating. So I think that the issue of, first of all, trying to understand what's happening to the world, which is critically important. What is the level of anger, malaise? What's the insecurity, the fear that seems to be driving the polarization? And then I think when you get to the individual situations, that's where the Tolstoy, you have to delve into understanding, in Myanmar, what are the roots of Buddhist extremism? How big is it? What do you do about it? How do you address it? Plus, how do you deal with 1 million people sitting in the mud in Bangladesh? So these are understanding each situation and dealing with the Indonesia, with the Nigeria, with the CAR, with South Sudan, all of these, including always what does religion have to do with it? How does the religious side fit in to the whole, but how do the other factors? How are other factors, what is happening with climate change? How's that driving the Fulani herder, the farmer tensions in the Middle Belt in Nigeria? So I think I also have to say we've talked about it, but we haven't talked very much about education. And obviously that's sort of the long-term answer. And it's not just educating everyone and dealing with the gap in secondary, which is the huge issue, and the quality issue, which are the global challenges for education right now. But it is also thinking about education on citizenship, the issue of values in education, and dealing in a practical way with religious literacy. And just to finish, I want to make clear that the gender issue is not only victims. Yes, 71% of the slavery people who are in modern slavery are women. The 15 out of 40 million is forced marriage, which is something religious leaders could do something about, the issue of child marriage and forced marriage. But it is also that the success, I mean, again, we've used the figures of how economic prosperity and religious freedom are correlated, but so is gender equality. Gender equality is an absolutely critical element, and it is the sort of one of the big assets of modernization, and there are lots of religious bodies that are still ambivalent about what that means.
Thank you. Ms. Ochab?
I speak as an advocate, activist, academic, or a hybrid of the three. I think the most important is to engage. And if you look at the different international mechanisms, there are always options to engage. But at the same time, if you don't find any options or opportunities to engage, just make new opportunities. And I've been working on a number of UN initiatives that there was no talk about them before, and of course there were many obstacles, but at the same time, if you see a door, just knock on them. If they open, it's great. If they don't, still, you tried. You can learn from any failures, you can adjust your approach. But also, I wanted to mention the different approaches we can take, for example, to seek justice, and what Lord Alton mentioned a moment ago about the failures of the international system. And I think advocates, academics, activists have been playing a very important role to fill the gap and the failure of the international system. And just looking at the two recent initiatives organized by academics, advocates, and activists. One is the China Tribunal, which was a people's tribunal to look into the situation in China and to look into the issue of organ harvesting from Falun Gong members. And of course, it was organized by independent experts. There was nothing like that before. There was no initiative like that at any of existing international mechanisms. So that was a way how to address the issue that the allegations of the organ harvesting are not being considered by anyone else. We need to look into it. We need to seek ways how to address the issue. And the second, it's a current initiative, is to look into the crimes against humanity perpetrated in North Korea. And again, it's going to be a people's tribunal looking into the atrocities, addressing the very fact that, for example, the UN Security Council failed to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court, or the fact that there is no other international ad hoc tribunal that would have the power to look into such atrocities. So we need to look into new options, how to address the failures of the international systems. Of course, what the People's Tribunal can do is very limited, but nonetheless, it is there to address the issue. It is there to investigate and to put more pressure on the other international systems to be more active.
Lord Alton?
Thank you.
Sorry, Evelyn, I think I cut you off. Go ahead and finish.
Just one more point.
Yeah, go ahead.
Very quickly. And of course, even within the existing mechanism, we need to be more active, look into different options of addressing issues. And one of the best examples is the recent decision from the Committee Against Torture that looked into one case of rape in the Bosnian War and how they considered the case at the Committee Against Torture to seek justice for the victim of rape from the Bosnian War.
Thank you. Lord Alton.
I think the challenge is for all of us is simply to stand against indifference, to challenge indifference, to get people actually aware of what is happening and the scale of what is happening. So let me say briefly, as a legislator, why I think Parliament, government, and the public are all key to this. In Parliament, we have to constantly raise issues, and Evelina's just mentioned one of them, the organ harvesting issue. I've been involved in that. We've held hearings in Parliament on this issue, but Sir Geoffrey Nice, Queen's Counsel, is a friend, and he has chaired the independent commission that Evelina referred to. He was one of the prosecutors who was involved in the aftermath of the atrocities in the Balkans. So he knows this territory, and there are many precedents going right back to the Cambodian genocide, going back to Vietnam as well, where independent tribunals have paved the way for more concerted international action to take place. In other words, we have to shine a light in our parliaments on these things. And over the decades, I've been very pleased to work with friends in other legislatures, not least in the United States. My good friend Congressman Chris Smith, for instance, and Sam Brownback, who's been a friend for 30 years. These are people you share information with and you take joint initiatives with. Jan Fiegel, who is the European Union Special Envoy on Freedom of Religion and Belief, is an old friend and someone that I'm able to pick the telephone up to and share information with and say, what can we do about these things? So raising awareness in our parliaments, but we can do it in more formal ways. I helped to found the all-party parliamentary group on freedom of religion or belief, and it's now one of the most effective groups, and I want to pay tribute, by the way, to the Church of Latter-day Saints for the support it's given as one of the stakeholders in that group, which means we were able to have a couple of employees and regularly raise questions and issues. Noelina, who's been rather modest, has done a huge amount of work on things like campaigning through that group to get the United Nations to create an annual day recognizing abuses against religious freedom. And we recently had a session in Parliament commemorating that day, but working with others, and in this context with Muslim members of the House of Commons. I'm Vice Chairman of the all-party group on the Uyghurs, which we founded with Yasmin Qureshi, who is a Muslim MP. Similarly, Rashnara Ali is a Muslim MP, and I'm an officer of her group working on the Rohingya issues with my colleague Jim Shannon, who should have been here with you, but is unwell. We jointly travelled to Pakistan, but we brought with us Professor Javed Rehman, who is the United Nations appointed special rapporteur on Iran, but he comes originally from Pakistan. He's a professor at one of our British universities, and he helped us by traveling with us and opening doors, and I was able to speak at the Islamic University, for instance, and to engage with the academy there. So using all-party parliamentary groups, not left or right, but across the spectrum and bicameral, across both houses, is an effective thing that can be done in all parliaments. We've just published a report on the Rohingyas. We've just published a report on Pakistan minorities. That then feeds into government. And so rather than government washing its hands and saying we didn't know anything about this, they can hardly say that when we give them information. We've done the same thing on organ harvesting. They literally said they had no evidence whatsoever in government of any of these things happening. And we were able to provide them with what Sir Geoffrey Nice said was indisputable evidence that Falun Gong, Uyghurs, and other disappeared people from various minorities have had their organs harvested, leading to their deaths. The scale of what is taking place, I was really delighted that our Foreign Secretary, our former Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, listened when many of us said to him, this is ridiculous that this issue is not higher on the list of priorities. And it was he who set up the special independent inquiry headed by Bishop Mounce Stephen, whom you mentioned earlier on, and which carried out over the course of a year the inquiry that led to this extraordinary report, 100 pages, setting out the scale of what is happening. Nobody could then say we didn't know it was happening. William Wilberforce famously said at the time of the slave trade, after they held investigative hearings in the House of Commons, no one will any longer be able to say they didn't know that this was underway. But every day, 11 Christians die, but 250 million worldwide are persecuted, but 1 in 5 has suffered some kind of religiously provoked attack. And finally, legislators and government respond to public pressure. I often point out that the British Parliament spent 700 hours debating fox hunting. When a fox arrives at Westminster holding a placard saying, "Save the human race," we might see the illogicality and disproportionality of some of the issues we seem to care about and the lack of interest we take in these far more serious questions. So how do you change that? Well, one thing that we started 3 years ago in Britain, I came up with an idea that we should try and light up 1 or 2 of our big church buildings in the heart of London in red. And we called it Red Wednesday. And so we lit up Westminster Cathedral and then Westminster Abbey. And I saw Mr. Speaker and I said, couldn't we light up the Houses of Parliament? He said, certainly, David. So we then had a synagogue that was lit up. We had some Muslims who came to speak as well at the event that we held to commemorate Red Wednesday. Young people started lighting up their Facebook pages, talking about it in schools, and it's been copied in other places. In America, there's now a Courage in Red Day in some jurisdictions. In Malta, they lit up the Triumphal Arch, and very movingly, a church that had been destroyed by ISIS on the Nineveh Plains, which has been rebuilt, was last year lit up in red now being used again. So that puts pressure on parliamentarians. And when elections come, a question that constituents should be asking their legislators, what are you going to do about freedom of religion or belief? When are you going to elevate this into the issue that it deserves to be? And I think that there has to be a groundswell of public opinion to match the scale of what is happening.
Overcoming indifference. I think everything that you said fits beautifully into that overarching framework. Mr. Cuepo, let's give you the final word.
Wow, how do you follow that? Well, I think that's an interesting question because I believe that everyone here agrees that the UN is perfect and doesn't have anything to change, right? Let me be an advocate for the organization. The UN will be as useless or as useful as member states allow us to be. We're an instrument. We are an international organization that depends on the willingness of the international community to use us in the way that we can facilitate the work. And I will disagree with the Archbishop that says that you cannot be an advocate and a media. The UN does it both, and we tried to. We're not perfect. But I think that, as Evelina also said, the Security Council has not been up to speed. The reason why, for the last 74 years, the UN has been able to change things such as the definition of peace. Peace is no longer that I'm not bombed at or shot at. It means that I have a quality of life, that I have a religious freedom, that I have the capacity to be equal to my other peers, regardless of gender or any other issues. The UN has been able to build and bring communities together. What we have done great, and I will advocate on that, is the multilateral approach to issues, which is bringing people together. And for the past 10, 15 years, I would say, and Dr. Aza Karam from the UNFPA, who also was a panelist here 2 years ago, she will agree, she chairs right now the Task Force on Religion and Sustainability, and is the inclusion of the religious perspective at the UN so that we can have voices. Let's face it, the UN came up with a wonderful plan of action for the next 11 years until 2030 called the Agenda 2030, Sustainable Development Goals. Fantastic. Nothing that the religious community has not been doing for thousands of years. We just put a good marketing campaign, we gave it icons, and we just made it beautiful, and we sold it as our own. That is not the case. What we have done well is learn from other institutions. I think that what we can do better moving forward is understand that the role that we have, and the role that we have is of service towards others, of being a facilitator for conversations, of being the tool that member states can rely on when they need a mediation, advocacy, or diplomacy. And of those three pillars, as I said, education, communication, and diplomacy, the UN is responsible for all three of them. Quality education of the people, quality communication of the issues, and quality diplomacy of bringing foes or not so good friends together to the table and give them the chance to talk and dialogue. That is the spirit of the UN. Again, what we're going to do it better is invite more people, but I think that we are on the path.
All right, thank you very much. I have two quick announcements. The first is there is a prayer room in room 3241 of the Wilkinson Center. If any of you need access to the prayer room, please ask any of our student volunteers and they can point you in the right direction. Secondly, our next session, there's a room change. The session scheduled for room 303 will be in room 314, and the session scheduled in 314 will be in 303. That means that the Interfaith Perspective session will not be in this room, but will be in room 314, and the South Korea session, which was scheduled for 314, will be here in this room. Please let me ask you to join me in thanking our panelists.